Nile āl-Sūdān continued. This leads us to another geographical red herring for which al-Idrisi seems to be responsible, but which proved to be such longevity that the British geographers were solemnly discussing it and trying to locate it on their maps in the early 19th century. That is the land, the island of Wangara. The term Wangara is first used, though with a confused spelling, by al-Bukhari, which applied it to a group of non-Arab long-distance traders who dealt in gold in ancient Ghana, essentially correct, for it is a term used until recently in the Middle Niger and Hausaland for manding merchants, otherwise known as the Daula. Al-Idrisi, however, makes of Wangara a piece of land, an island surrounded by the Nile to the east of Ghana. In his text, he tells us that it is inundated by the Nile waters annually and that after the flood, people swarm over it to search for gold. Susan Keach McIntosh has suggested that what al-Idrisi was really describing was the inland delta of the Niger in modern Mali, which stretches from about the vicinity of Sand in the south to Godoum area in the north. Certainly, al-Idrisi dimensions for the island, 300 miles long and 150 miles wide, are close enough, and this statement that the flood begins in August also matches the reality of the Niger River inundation regime. But the identification is not so simple as that, for the theory and reality are extremely intertwined in al-Idrisi, and he combines two separate types of information to produce a hybrid and mythical third. The original area of Wangara was undoubtedly the Arafirius Bambuhu region, situated between the Bafing and the Bakhor tributaries of the Senegal River and still known as Gangaran, which probably gave its name to merchants who visited it regularly in pursuit of gold to sell to North African merchants. Though it does not become inundated annually, it is nevertheless surrounded almost completely by rivers. On the other hand, it is likely that Wangara merchants were establishing themselves in towns of the interior delta such as Dai and perhaps Kabara as early as the first half of the 12th century. Modern Jean, too, may have originally been settled by Wangara merchants who made it their base while doing business with non-Muslims or Old Jean until the ruler of that town converted to Islam in the 1200th century and moved his court to the new site. Accounts of the area from such merchants of the area would have filtered back up the Saharan trails and into North Africa. Thus, what we most probably have is a conflated description of the Bafing Bakhor Wangara, where people really did find gold, and the interior delta of the Niger, where Wangara merchants were operating and which really did become inundated annually. It is even possible that al-Idrisi Ghana, which he describes as consisting of two towns of opposite banks of the River Nile near the land of Wangara, may be a conflation of accounts relating to an earlier capital of ancient Ghana and more recent accounts of the Old New Gen. As noted earlier, al-Idrisi was the Arab geographer who seems to have most influenced European geographers down to the 19th century. And the reason for this is very simple. His was the earliest work of its kind to be published in Europe. An Arabic text on the shorthand version was published in Rome in 1592. An Italian translation of this appeared in 1600, followed by a Latin transcription in 1619 and published in Paris. The other Arab writer whose work was to have a lasting influence was the early 16th century Moroccan Andalusian al-Hassan b. Muhammad al-Wazan al-Zanani, better known as the European writings as Leo Africanus. He had actually traveled in West Africa, though, to less places than he claims, and obtained his Latin name when the ship in which he was traveling in the Mediterranean was seized by pirates, and he wound up being presented as a gift to the Pope Leo X. Whilst in Rome, it is not clear whether he never returned home. He wrote on the account of North Africa, Egypt, and West Africa, mainly based on his own personal knowledge and what he had learned from his contemporaries, but influenced, nevertheless, by early Arab writers to whom he occasionally refers, including al-Idrisi. He wrote in Italian, which was then polished up by his publisher, Ramesso, for inclusion in his collection of travels published in 1550. A French translation followed in 1556, and in the same year a Latin translation was published in Antwerp. Finally, an English translation was published in London in 1600. Thus, Europe required an actual description of Timbuktu, whose existence had been known to at least some European scholars from the maps of Jewish cartographers of Majorca since the late 14th century. Gayo, Agadez, several of Hassa's city-states, and Borno, what they also acquired was further confusion of the question of the West African Nile, to which Leo gave his name Niger, which it still bears, and Onwangara. Leo's Niger seems to flow out of Lake Chad, and although he alludes to another view, perhaps he had read Ibn Battuta, namely that it starts in mountains in the west and flows eastward. He disowns it based on what he claims to be a personal experience. In the middle of the land of the blacks flows the River Niger, which begins in the desert called Siu, where it emerges from a great lake. According to what our geographers claim, the Niger is a branch of the Nile which disappears underground and reemerges to form a lake. Some say that the river originates in mountains in the west and flows eastward to turn into a lake. That is not correct. In fact, we have traveled along it, starting in the eastern Timbuktu and flowed on current in Guinea, Jin, and the Kingdom of Mali, both to west of Timbuktu. This apparent eyewitness testimony did a great disservice to European geographers, as did the placing of Gongara among the Hassa states and calling it kingdom. Cartographers such as Dutchman Blue in 1664 and the Frenchman d'Anville 1750 struggled to make sense of such conflicting information. Blue shows that the Niger flowing out of the lake in Central Africa close to upper reaches of the Egyptian Nile flowing into and out of the second lake and then into a third lake close to Gongara before passing to yet another lake and finally to the Atlantic in the delta of the River Senegal is but one channel. D'Anville, who an English knowledge of the River Gambia shows these as two distinct rivers flowing east-west into the Atlantic. The Niger appears to have its source in the west, not far from the source of the River Senegal, and to end in the lake to the east of the Wangara and towards tributaries of the Egyptian Nile. Here, then, is a river that flows from nowhere to nowhere, and is joined to Hassa country by the River Limlam, a throwback to El-Adrisi. This was still essentially the position where Arrowsmith showed the Niger or Nile el-Abib or Nile el-Abid Slaves River, flowing past Timbuktu past Barisu or Bassa and near Yoria, both known to D'Anville, after which its course reflects Andresian geography complete with an island of Wangara that is said to be overflowed in August. An ancient long since forgotten towns such as Turku or Tarka, Yarnisi, and Sinkamar, only after missions of Denham, and Clampton and Tripoli through Borno and Sokoto in 1822-24, and the Lander brothers' exploration of the Niger from near Yara to its delta in 1830 was the map to be straightened out and the course of the Niger traced from its source in the Fouta-Djallon highlands of Guinea to its mouth on the Atlantic coast of Nigeria. Be sure to go to kofipisidetv.com and purchase your copy of Spears of the Mossi, Historical Survey of the Mines for African Warriors, Volume 1. Pre-order today. Release 5/25.